Hello everybody, I'm Ann York, and I want to ask you a question. What is anarchism? You might not know it, but it's an important question. You might have an idea in your head of a city on fire. People running around looting, killing, throwing Molotovs, and just general, anarchy. This is what a lot of people think of when people think of anarchism. They think it's a society or community with no government, no elections, no laws or mandates, a society where everything is survival of the fittest and no one's there to protect the weak. This is the preconception that decades of propaganda and class warfare have put in our heads. The capitalist ruling class who have embedded themselves like ticks in every aspect of our lives would like us all to believe that their existence is a necessity, that they are needed to keep the world running, and by extension the state which protects and collaborates with the capitalist class is also an essential entity to human survival and cooperation. To them, the idea that we can live without these rulers, without the state, is ludicrous. If they weren't the ones who should rule, they wouldn't be the rulers, would they? If God didn't give his divine right to the king and his court to rule over the serfs, then he wouldn't be in that position, would he? Obviously, the state and government are necessary to keep the unruly, unwashed masses under control, right? This has been a sentiment amongst the ruling class for a very long time, from the emperors, kings, and lords of the feudal age to the CEOs, bankers, and politicians of our modern age. And I'm happy to tell you that all these preconceptions are wrong. At their basis, these are all forms of manufactured consent, meant to keep us from questioning the dominant superstructure we all live under. To put it simply, no matter what the questions are, how valid they are, or how important thinking about them could be, the ruling class doesn't want you asking the questions that'll threaten their own best interests, plain and simple. That is why I'm asking you this question again. What is anarchism? Now, there are a million and one different definitions of anarchism out there from many different people much smarter than me, and some of those would probably disagree with my assessment. Lucky for me, they're not making the video, so we're just going to keep on keeping on. In its most fundamental form, anarchism can be defined as a rejection of unjust hierarchies and the belief that these unjust hierarchies must be abolished for the fairest, most egalitarian system of human organization possible. Unjust hierarchies such as 1. The boss-employee wage-slavery relationship inherent to capitalism. 2. The oppression of racial, sexual, and gender minorities in order for those in power to assert their authority and pit the lower classes against one another. And 3. The monopolization of force by the state, which will do everything to prop up and to preserve its own power above all else. That last one is important. A lot of people think anarchists just want to get rid of the government while also conflating the government with the state. The abolition of the state, as well as all coercive authorities, is one of the end goals of anarchism, but isn't anarchism itself. Much like how class agitation and contradictions is a product of capitalism, but isn't capitalism itself. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who first coined the term anarchism, put it like this: as man seeks justice and equality, so society seeks order and anarchy. This is why anarcho-capitalism is an oxymoron and not anarchism. The goal of anarchism is to abolish unjust hierarchies, and a society based on capitalism is by definition a society based around unjust hierarchies. Anarcho-capitalism in all practicality would just amount to corporate feudalism. Miss me with that bootlicker shit. Now let's go over hierarchies, starting with the employee-boss relationship. This isn't hard to comprehend. Any Marxist on the street can tell you how it works. A worker is hired by a boss, that boss pays him $10, and the reason that worker is paid $10 is because the boss is making $30 off their labor. So, by the very fact that someone works in a capitalist system, they are being ripped off. The private hirer wouldn't hire someone unless they can make the most money possible, and this leads to an unequal distribution of power, where the worker is dependent on the owner, and the owner couldn't care less whether the worker lives or dies. Because, there are another 1,000 plebs out there looking for a job, isn't there? This is wage slavery. The idea that we, the working class, are so dependent on our capitalist owners that we're not people anymore. We're just commodities to be bought and sold. Our lives are based on our salaries. We need to make money or we live in miserable, life-threatening conditions, and the only supposed freedom from this is to make enough money. This is the inherent unjustness in wage labor. The kindest, sweetest, most appreciative boss is still a boss, and his class interests have nothing in common with your class interests. In fact, they are opposed to each other. I'll expound on this a little more when I get to the Anarcho-Syndicalism section of the video. In the final analysis, the anarchists cannot suffer what the IWW has come to call, quote-unquote, the boss. And they will always struggle for the liberation of workers. We have nothing to lose but our chains, etc., etc. Second is the oppression of racial, sexual, and gender minorities currently and throughout history in order to secure the interests of those in power. Now, I hope you'll excuse me as I put on my conspiratorial philosophy hat for a second. What is the easiest way for the powerful to enforce hierarchies? Enforce the idea of a hegemonic norm that everyone needs to follow. Anyone who doesn't conform to that norm, whether they not be your race or ethnicity, whether they behave in a way that doesn't conform to your society's standard of gender, or whether they don't even conform to that gender at all, is considered an enemy. And so the black man, the rebellious woman, the gay man, the trans or non-binary person who share very similar class interests to yours is considered an enemy, and you're pitted against one another instead of against the ruling class who really holds all the cards and keeps you enslaved. In my country of America, it's historically and contemporarily been perpetuated by the fear of illegal immigrants. In Europe, for a very long time, it was the Jews. The liberation of women from patriarchal oppression was a fight that lasted for most of the 20th century and still goes on today in the form of women's bodily autonomy. Looking at you, Alabama. I don't think I even need to go over the fight against homophobia and transphobia around the world. And why have these conditions been around for so much of the history of advanced civilization? Because those in power enforced rigid social hierarchies in order to keep the lower classes in control via tribalism, gender roles, and religion, because it makes it easier for said lower classes to consent to the power of the state. Why do you think so many religions have historically enforced these rigid gender roles and condemned to homosexuality? Because these organized religions have always worked with the state to grant an air of legitimacy to the power of the state so as to secure their own power. In India and Europe, it was special because the priest class tried to assert themselves as above the power of secular rulers. In Islam, there is no secular ruler. The ruler of the state was also the religious ruler. The powerful have always used religion and culture to cement their own power over the people. Rudolf Rocker goes over this very in depth in his book Nationalism and Culture, which I will summarize and review on this channel in the future, so be on the lookout for that. But the important thing to take away is that anarchism is for complete social justice and equality. The history of social justice is the history of anarchism. It was at the front of every black pride, gay pride, trans pride, and women's liberation movement and will stay there until we live in an egalitarian society. Trans rights. Lastly is the state, which consolidates its own power as much as possible and above all else to rule over others. Now, when anarchists define the state, we usually use the definition made up by Max Weber, where a state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. The state in this context is an entity which holds a monopoly over force and which works to maintain that power of coercion. Whether it be a fascist dictatorship or a liberal democratic republic, the state will always work to maintain its own power and authority. My government of the United States of America monopolizes force in its geographic area of the 50 states of America, directing it towards foreign populations through its armed forces and a domestic population through the police force. My government has checks and balances designed to keep a balance of power between its separate branches, which it doesn't follow. There are many instances where government actors don't adhere to these limitations and nothing is done. See the War on Terror and the Patriot Act. Enshrined in its Constitution is a Bill of Rights, so it can't abuse its citizens, which it violates constantly. The current president and previous presidents have extrajudiciously killed citizens. One lauded by liberals as a force for change and progress did it with the excuse of should have had better parents. Protesting and the right to address grievances is meant to be protected by the state, except protesting requires a permission from the state, and when they feel the protesters are getting a little too uppity, the state kicks into high gear and shuts down the protest. And finally, the state is meant to have a judicial system to ensure that everyone is given a fair trial regardless of who they are, which doesn't happen. Just look at how black and Hispanic people in the United States are often given harsher sentences for committing the same crime and are jailed at much higher rates. The point I'm trying to get at here is that quite simply the state works to cement its own power and authority above all else, and the well-being of its citizenry, more often than not, is a secondary consideration, if it's a consideration at all. Anarchism as a movement to achieve the maximum possible freedom and justice for society will always be categorically opposed to the state. One last thing before we end this section. We went over unjust hierarchies, but I feel there's something equally important that my anarchist comrades don't talk enough about, which is what is a just hierarchy? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I think David Graeber puts it best with his description of self-subverting authority. To put it simply, it's authority that exists to undermine itself. For example, a good teacher teaches a student, so the student no longer needs the teacher. Or a good doctor treats their patient, so the patient no longer needs the doctor. And good parents exist, so the child no longer needs them when they grow up. All these are authorities that subvert themselves, and in the end, render themselves inept. Really, that is the basis of anarchism, the idea, as Noam Chomsky said, that hierarchies of power need to justify themselves. It's the idea that we shouldn't just worship authority. Authority needs a justified reason to exist, and if we can make a system where an authority is unnecessary, then we should. How we get to that system, though, is another question, and that's the territory of You may have heard of people who call themselves anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, anarcho-primitivists, etc. There are many different brands of anarchism that believe in many different things, and many different ways by which to bring about an anarchist society. I can spend an entire video giving short explanations on the different schools of anarchism, but that's not what I'm here for. Watch your drag if you want that. I am going to focus on anarcho-communism and anarcho-syndicalism. Also, as I said before, anarcho-capitalism isn't anarchism, it's just feudalism with bitcoins. We're not touching it. I'll start with anarcho-communism and then finish with my own ideology, since these seem to be the most common and popular currents in the modern anarchist movement. Anarcho-communism, as Kropotkin described it, is a state of society in where all requisites for production must and will become the common property of society and be managed in common by the producers of wealth. The producers of wealth being the workers who make society function. Their motivating goals are seizing the means of production and having common ownership over them, abolishing the wage system and money in general, and creating horizontally structured society based on the old meme of from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. Anarcho-communism tends to act as a catch-all term, including elements of individualist and insurrectionist anarchism. They differ from just plain old communists in that regular communists believe in a transitionary state they call the dictatorship of the proletariat, as Marx wrote. By the way, it's not actually a dictatorship. I know, it's really bad marketing. Anarcho-communists argue, rightly I might add, that the transitionary state would have no reason to move towards a stateless, moneyless society that we all desire, so the revolution would need to go straight to an anarchist society where everyone works for the betterment of themselves and the betterment of those around them. Think Star Trek, except Starfleet is completely different and probably doesn't exist. The Federation is a police state, don't at me. Ancoms want to live in a society based on what Kropotkin called a commune of communes, because communal living allows people to maintain social order without regimented laws or hierarchies. We'll go into communal living in a later video. How we get to this, though, is a topic of debate amongst many ANCOMs, and one popular strategy happens to be Anarcho-Syndicalism. So I'm an anarcho-syndicalist, meaning I believe that the most efficacious way by which we can take control of our economy and create an anarchist society is through the use of labor unions, known as syndicates. I also have a few bits of anarcho-feminism, green anarchism, and info-anarchism sprinkled into my worldview, but we'll get into specific beliefs in a later video. Anarcho-syndicalism has a lot of history in French Marxism, specifically Sorelianism, specifically syndicalism. Duh. I already explained the bare bones basics of wage slavery, and in Anson thought, wage slavery might as well be Satan. Except, unlike Satan, wage slavery is real, and instead of being an edgy angel, it's the worst thing to ever come out of the Industrial Revolution. And the promoter of wage slavery is the boss, quote unquote, or the owner, or the capitalist, the grand poobah, whatever you want to call him. As I stated above, the interests of the capitalist class and the working class not only have nothing in common, but are directly opposed to one another. Your enslavement to wage labor is their benefit, and they'll fight tooth and nail to maintain it. Your dependence on them is to their benefit. Your freedom, self-reliance, and independence from the boss is an injury to the boss, because one less worker they can exploit is an injury to their bottom line, which is an injury to them. And they'll fight tooth and nail to place themselves above and you below, so that they can keep wringing every single penny they can from you. And they want you to be grateful for it. That is wage slavery, the massive imbalance of power and agency between the workers and the boss. Whether you believe it or not, class conflict is happening everywhere. It's literally killing us. And as the IWW say, an injury to one is an injury to all. And one of, if not the biggest priorities of anarcho-syndicalists is to destroy this relation by quote-unquote smashing the boss via the use of direct action. See, Ansons have a huge mistrust of party politics and lobbying the government for the well-being of workers, again, rightly I might add, and propose instead using direct action. This involves things like strikes, sit-ins, and blockades or sabotage. Basically, instead of relying on negotiations or politics, the workers take matters into their own hands and organize into syndicates to fight for their own interests, which is ultimately to abolish the great disparity in power responsible for wage slavery. Now, the beauty of syndicates is that while a trade union, which are actually fairly conservative organizations, need to work under the authority of the state, a syndicate can work independently of the state and subvert it. So workers can organize themselves around a workplace and send delegates to their syndicates, which sends its own delegates to a larger federation responsible for logistics and communications in this interlinked liquid democratic system. And instead of the current federal government, which rules over us as Lord, this will be a decentralized direct democratic system. That is anarcho-syndicalism. As Noam Chomsky explains, a federated, decentralized system based on free associations where people don't have to just be cogs in a huge capitalist machine meant to chew up people, break their bodies and spirits, and shit out money. And I'll just end this section with the quote from Chomsky, because I can't say it better than the king himself.
Well, let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as Anarcho-Syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
A lot of people think anarchism is impractical or can't work from our current system. The popular sentiment from somewhat informed people is anarchists have laudable goals and are important to helping society become fairer, more tolerant, and overall better, but their solutions are impractical. People can't behave in the way you need for it to work. Human nature, it's impossible. But I ask you, what is more impractical than our current system under a capitalist state? Our planet isn't dying, it's being killed. People aren't starving, they're being starved. And the government isn't spying on and abusing the rights of its own citizens. It has been spying on and abusing the rights of its own citizens for a very long time. They say people aren't good enough to live without a state. And I say, how can any intelligent person take an objective look at the world around us and say that drivel? The reality is no human being is good enough to live in a state. To advocate for the state, you have to assume that no one will ever try to use that monopolization over force to further their own power at the expense of everyone else. To advocate for capitalism, you have to assume that no one will try to exploit others for their own benefit. And if you're an ANCAP, you probably praise that exploitation just as a medieval doctor would praise the use of leeches. And I'm not saying the society I propose is some perfect utopia. I'm not a fascist. I don't deal in utopian thinking. There will be problems. There will always be problems, but it's a society where people value freedom, human decency, justice, and democracy. If you believe in these things, and you take these beliefs to their natural conclusions, you arrive at anarchism. I'll end this with a quote by none other than George Orwell when he described the anarcho-syndicalist society being built by the CNT and FAI during the Spanish Civil War in his book Homage to Catalonia, which we will absolutely go over in the future. It was beautiful. It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. This shows you what human beings are like when they are trying to behave as human beings and not cogs in a capitalist machine. That, to me, is anarchism. The promise that we can finally live like people. And you can say it's idealistic, but don't say it's impossible. It's completely possible. There's just a lot of people who don't want you to believe it's possible. And despite that, we'll fight to see that promise realized, no matter how long it takes. And I would welcome any of you to join us. You just have to start by asking a question. The same question I asked before I came to where I am now. What is anarchism?